There was a kind of America that most people under 50 have never seen and never will. Not the America of monuments and textbooks, not the America of political speeches or patriotic postcards, but a quieter one, a smaller one in the best possible sense. An America where you could drive for an hour on a 2-lane road through the middle of a town you'd never heard of, and by the time you left, you knew the name of the man who ran the filling station. You'd eaten the best pie of your life at a counter with 6 stools, and you understood, in some wordless way, that this place had a pulse, that it was alive, that it had always been alive, long before you arrived, and would keep on being alive long after you were gone. That America existed. Millions of people lived inside it. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, a ribbon of concrete came through and split it apart. If this kind of memory means something to you, stay with us. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. We make these films for people who remember and who deserve to have what they remember honored. Let's go back to before, not in a fairy tale way, in the real way, the specific, irreplaceable way. Picture a main street in the 1940s or early 1950s. Not the main street of a big city, but the main street of a town with maybe 4,000 people. A town in Ohio, or Arkansas, or Central California, or Western Pennsylvania. It almost doesn't matter which state, because the architecture of daily life was surprisingly similar from one end of the country to the other. There was a hardware store with a wooden floor that creaked and smelled of machine oil and sawdust. There was a 5 and dime with bins of buttons and a candy counter where kids pressed their noses against the glass. There was a barbershop with a striped pole that turned, and inside, 2 chairs, a smell of talcum powder and bay rum, and a conversation that had essentially been going on, uninterrupted, since 1922. There was a movie house with a marquee that changed on Fridays. A pharmacy with a soda fountain. A bank with marble floors and a clock above the door that everyone in town used to set their watches. These were not quaint things. They were not charming decorations from a simpler time. They were the actual machinery of human community. They were the places where people saw each other, needed each other, out-argued and laughed and made plans and grieved. They were how a town held itself together, and they were all connected, physically, literally connected, by a road that ran through the center of everything. Not a highway, a road. A road with a speed limit of 25 through town, with stop signs and pedestrians and a crossing guard outside the school on weekday mornings. A road you had to slow down on, which meant you had to see things, which meant you had to be, for a few minutes, inside the life of a place, rather than passing over it at 70 miles an hour. That distinction sounds small. It was not small. Before the Interstates, traveling across America meant passing through America. Every 100 miles or so, you dropped down from whatever rural stretch you'd been driving and entered a town. You stopped because you needed gas or food, or because the kids were restless and your wife had been patient long enough. You pulled into a place with a name, not a franchise number, but a name. Vera's Kitchen, the Blue Moon Diner, Hazel's, just Hazel's, because everyone already knew. You ate food that someone had made that morning in the kitchen behind that counter. You heard local accents shift slightly from the town you'd stopped in 2 hours before. You noticed that the courthouse in this town was brick, not stone, and that the war memorial out front listed names from families that still lived here. That the boy who pumped your gas had the same last name as one of those names on the memorial, and if you'd had time, if you'd asked, he would have told you that was his grandfather. This was not tourism. This was America at actual scale, human scale, the scale at which a country is actually made and held together. And it was vulnerable, more vulnerable than anyone understood at the time. The Federal Aid Highway Act was signed in 1956. President Eisenhower supported it, and he had reasons that were real. Military logistics, economic efficiency, National defense in the shadow of the Cold War. The reasoning was not dishonest. The intentions were not malicious. But intentions and consequences are different things. What the interstate system did over the following 2 decades was quietly and systematically bypass the places that had held the country together at the human level. The road that had once run through the center of a town and forced every traveler to slow down and notice it, that road was now a faded alternative route running parallel to the shining new highway that cut past 3 miles to the south. 3 miles doesn't sound like much. 3 miles is everything. When the traffic stopped coming through, the filling station on Main Street lost half its business in the first year. The diner that had fed travelers for 30 years watched its counter empty out. The motel with the hand-painted sign and the swimming pool shaped like a kidney bean sat quiet through summers that had once been fully booked. The business owners tried. They put up signs on the interchange exit. They ran ads in the regional paper. Some of them held on for years out of sheer stubbornness and love for the place. But you cannot fight a bypass. Not really. What happened to those towns happened slowly enough that most people didn't name it as it was occurring. A business would close and people would say it was just that particular business, just bad luck, just the times. Then another would close. Then the young people who had grown up there would start to leave, not because they didn't love the town, but because the town could no longer hold them economically, and the town would get quieter. And quieter. And the hardware store would become a used clothing shop and then close. And the movie house would show its last picture on a Saturday night in October of 1960-something, and the owner would turn off the marquee for the last time, and the town would lose something it could not name and could not replace. Not every town died. Some found new identities. Some were close enough to a growing city to absorb its expansion. Some had something, a factory, a college, a natural resource that kept them breathing, but thousands did not survive the bypass. And even the ones that survived lost something essential in the split, something that was never rebuilt. Because what the highways split apart was not only commerce, it was sequence. Before the interstates, America had a physical logic to it. You understood where you were in relation to where you'd been. Distances meant something because you'd lived through them, mile by mile, through landscapes and towns, and the slow change of regional accents and roadside vegetation. You arrived somewhere having truly traveled there, having passed through the intermediate reality between here and there. The interstate collapsed all of that. It made distance abstract. You entered at an on-ramp and you exited, and in between, America became a long abstraction of signs and median strips and rest areas with vending machines. The places in between were not gone. They were still there, 3 miles to the south or 5 miles to the east, but they had become invisible. They had been edited out of the American experience of moving through America. And something shifted in the culture too, though it was hard to track precisely. The roadside landscape that had been shaped by individual human decisions, the hand-lettered sign, the family motel with its particular name, the diner that served one regional specialty that you could not get anywhere else, was gradually replaced by a roadside landscape shaped by corporate decisions, by franchise logic, by the idea that a traveler should be able to stop anywhere in America and find exactly the same thing they'd find somewhere else, so they never had to risk the unfamiliar, the same hamburger, the same motel room, the same coffee in the same paper cup. It was efficient. It was designed for comfort and convenience. And it quietly, steadily, drained the country of the texture that had made it recognizable as a country of actual places, inhabited by actual people with actual local histories. You could feel it if you were paying attention. Even as a child, even in the 1960s, you could feel the difference between stopping in a real town and stopping at an interchange cluster of national brands. One felt like entering something. The other felt like nowhere, like between, like a pause inside a journey that had no real middle. The people who built those roads believed they were stitching America together. And in some ways, in some very real and important ways, they were. The economic growth the interstates enabled was not imaginary. The way they allowed goods to move, the way they supported manufacturing and distribution across the continent, the way they made it possible for families to see more of their country, none of that was nothing. But stitching together is not the same as connecting. You can stitch things together and still leave the living tissue of a place untouched, cut off, bypassed. And that is, in the end, closer to what happened. The country was stitched together along the seams of commerce and speed, and the interior, the actual interior of town life, local loyalty, or regional identity, the kind of knowledge you only get by being somewhere long enough to know its people, that interior was left on the other side of the interchange, 3 miles down a road nobody traveled anymore. There is a particular quality of afternoon light on a main street that has been bypassed. If you've driven those roads, the old routes, the 2 lanes that run alongside the interstates like shadows, you know the light. It falls on storefronts that are half occupied or entirely empty, on hand-painted signs gone pale with 20 years of sun, on a barbershop that still has a pole out front, even though it's been a tax preparation office since 1981. There are still people there. That is the thing. There are still people, and they still have the full richness of private human lives. And they still know the names of their neighbors, and they still gather at whatever remains of the center of their town. The life was not extinguished. Life is harder to extinguish than that. But the conversation between that place and the rest of the country, the conversation that used to happen naturally, every day, every time a stranger pulled off the road and sat at the counter and asked what was good today, that conversation was severed. And severed conversations, over decades, become forgotten languages. What we lost was not just physical, it was a way of knowing the country, a way of belonging to it, a way of understanding, from the inside of lived experience, that America was not one thing, but thousands of things. Thousands of places with their own pace and flavor and story, all of them equally real, us equally part of what this country was. That understanding was not abstract. It was built into the act of travel itself, when travel meant passing through. And now it is 60 or 70 years later, and you can drive from one coast to the other and barely touch anything real. You can look out the window at the same green signs, the same rest areas, the same franchise clusters at every exit, and understand intellectually that you are crossing a continent without ever quite feeling it, without ever quite arriving in the middle of it. Those of us who remember the before, who rode in the back seat on a summer road trip before 1960, watching the towns come and go through the window, feeling the car slow down and the world become specific and close, we carry something that cannot be fully explained to someone who has only ever known the highway version of this country. We remember what it felt like when everywhere was somewhere. We remember main streets that were still alive in the fullness of their original purpose. We remember the smell of a diner that had been a diner for 40 years and smelled like it. We remember filling station attendants who wiped your windshield and asked where you were headed and meant the question, because to them, every traveler was briefly a guest in the place they loved. We remember that America, the one that existed at human scale, the one that breathed slowly and kept its history in plain sight on its storefronts and its courthouses and its war memorials. It was not perfect. No America has ever been perfect. There were people in those towns who were not welcome at those counters, and that wrong ran deep and long and cannot be papered over with nostalgia. The before was not a golden age for everyone, and honesty demands we say so. But the thing that was good, the genuine, irreplaceable thing, was the existence of place itself, the texture of particularity, the fact that one town was not the same as another and never would be. That is what the highways split apart. Not the country, exactly. Something harder to name than the country. Something more like the country's sense of its own interior. It is still there, some of it. Drive the old routes and you will find it. Quieter now. Slower. a little worn at the edges, but still itself, still particular, still alive in the way that only a real place can be alive. And if you find it, slow down, stop, sit at whatever counter remains, ask what's good today, because some conversations, even after all these years, are still worth having. And some things that were split apart can still, in small and human ways, be found again. If these memories mean something to you, we'd be honored to have you here with us. Subscribe and come back. There is so much more worth remembering together.